This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, thought and debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dalia Shenlin. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Donald Macintyre. He has been the Jerusalem correspondent for the independent newspaper between 2004 and 2012. He covered Israel and the occupied territories, as well as traveling for the paper to Iraq, Turkey, Jordan, Libya, and Egypt, and publishing widely for other papers since then. He has written several books, but today we'll be talking about his most recent book, Gaza, Preparing for Dawn, published by One World, and we'll be trying to figure out who lost Gaza and who can save it. Don Macintyre, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
How did you come to the idea at all that Gaza needed a separate book devoted just to Gaza? Why is this such a distinct story within the greater Palestinian story?
Well, that's a very good question, Dalia. I think that one of the things I felt was a sort of weird sense of privilege that it was possible for foreign correspondents, and not for so many other people who were not Palestinians, and even for people who were Palestinians actually, to travel in and out of Gaza, between Israel and Gaza. And as you know, actually, I think from 2006 onwards, after Hamas won the elections, the many Israeli journalists who used to go in and out of Gaza stopped it was an Israeli government decision that they should no longer be allowed to go. And therefore, in a funny way, you feel in a sort of slightly, as I say, privileged minority, being able to travel and to see both sides of the story, and I felt I wanted to do something with that. And I think the other thing was that I used to work occasionally with an Italian journalist called Alberto Stabile, and he said to someone I know, "Oh, well, of course, Don really loves Gaza." And I'd never really thought of that at all. But then I thought about it, and I thought in a sort of funny way, in a very, I must say, unromantic and unsentimental way, it is a very attaching kind of place. And I guess I wanted to say a few things about it that, I didn't feel had been said before.
What is it about Gaza that you love? What does it mean to love a place? You love the people? Something's different about Gaza than other Palestinian areas?
Well, I certainly think it is partly the people. And of course, the very, very big difference between it and other Palestinian areas is it's by the sea. And actually, it has a pretty spectacular coastline, which I've known from, since before disengagement in 1995, when the Israeli surfing team used to surf off the main, off Gush Katif coast. So the sea makes a big difference. It's the only maritime part of the occupied territories. And yes, the people are, they have some very characteristic elements which are very appealing. A kind of terrific sense of humor, terrific amount of resilience, which is one of the things I try and write about in the book. And I guess also the fact that it's so enclosed, and this is not a very good reason for liking it, but it does make you feel that you're in a place which not so many people are in, and that's kind of exciting too.
Even though there are many people there.
Yes, nearly 2 million.
Yeah.
Yes.
But are there any really specific characteristics, politically I'm talking about, things about Gaza that tell the Palestinian story in a different way to looking at the occupied territories in general?
Well, to be a bit more sober about it, I think that Gaza has obviously suffered. Its life in the West Bank is not good, and wouldn't dream of suggesting otherwise. But I think in some ways Gaza has represented over the last 10 years some of the most extreme aspects of what we normally call the occupation. And we can argue if you want about whether Gaza is still occupied or not.
We'll get to that.
And therefore, it does also seem to me quite a good place to discuss or to look at in a kind of microcosm the wider issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And of course, the other thing about it is that it has a very high proportion, well over 50%, of the descendants of 1948 refugees, which means, therefore, that it's in very concentrated form. It kind of represents the 20th century history of the conflict as well.
I want to talk about the separation/isolation of Gaza. You point out that this was a policy that the Israeli government was sort of slowly but increasingly openly admitting to before the disengagement even. Tell us about the evolution of that idea of a policy of separation between Gaza and the West Bank.
Well, I think if you go back to 1967, Moshe Dayan, I think, did have a policy. Now, his critics would say this was really, partly to subdue Palestinian nationalism. But whatever the reasons, he did have this sense or idea of the invisible occupation, so-called. And what that did mean was that the border of Gaza was, for quite a long period, very porous. Tens of thousands of Palestinian workers in Gaza were leaving the territory every day to work for Israeli employers. It meant that business was certainly happening at quite a reasonable level between Gazans and Israelis. Israelis were also coming into Gaza to buy fish, eat in good, pretty cheap restaurants, get their cars fixed. There was a degree of porousness of that border for a long period. And one of the kind of paradoxes, I think, of the present situation is that many older Palestinians in Gaza look back on that time relatively nostalgically and relatively benignly. Now, of course, nobody's suggesting that Gaza in the 60s and particularly in the 70s was a kind of great place to live. But I think the fact, particularly Palestinian businessmen and people who worked in Israel, often in the construction industry as farm workers and the rest of it, the fact that they look back pretty nostalgically on that period is an indication of how bad things have become economically. Then I think what happened, to get back to your question, Dalia, what I think then happened in the early 90s, really from 91, 92 onwards, towards the end of the First Intifada, the Israelis began very gradually, Israel government, to restrict that movement. You had to have a permit to leave. And nonetheless, through most of the 90s and even into the period of the Second Intifada, there were plenty of people still getting in and out to work in Israel, and to a lesser extent the West Bank. But then very gradually, I think that did give way to a policy of separation. And one of the little sort of chronological details that I think people tend to forget is that when he was industry minister, Ehud Olmert closed the Erez industrial zone, which was one of those very places where Israelis and Palestinians really did meet. He closed it actually before disengagement. Now, he said it was security reasons, but, there wasn't actually a particular security crisis at the time. And I think that's a little indication that the policy had gone, full circle from Dayan's view of what an occupation should look like.
But of course, it's not just down to Israel, because if you're right that the coup that Hamas kicked out Fatah and gained power in Gaza is perhaps the single most significant event in Gaza's history. But my question to you is, isn't it just a culmination of decades-old antagonisms between Gaza and the West Bank? Weren't they on different trajectories for a long time before that? I mean, look at Gaza. It's much more religious, much more traditional.
But was it always that way, or was that an evolution based on Israeli policy?
Well, I think, first of all, actually, if you go back to the 60s, Palestinians talk about, people used to go and bathe in bikinis at outside the UN beach club. It was a much more liberal place. The Gaza population in the 60s, 70s, even into the 90s were kind of movie mad. There were 4 or 5 very successful cinemas in Gaza. I'm not sure. Look, of course, it has always been, particularly the south of Gaza and Rafah and Khan Yunis, have always been pretty socially conservative and with a strong religious bent. But I'm not completely convinced that Gaza is naturally a totally religious fundamentalist place, to put it mildly. And actually, I think that in a sort of paradoxical way, what's happened is the closure of Gaza over 10 years has helped those people, including many people in Hamas, who are quite comfortable with the idea of people not being able to leave, not being able to go in and out of Israel, not even sometimes being able to get abroad to study, and therefore be exposed to other influences.
But not just socially, I'm also talking politically. I mean, if Fatah clearly had much stronger grip in the West Bank than it ever did in Gaza, even before 2007.
Well, true up to a point, though, of course, Abu Iyad and Abu Jihad, Arafat's closest lieutenants, actually both came from Gaza. So, I mean, I don't think that it's necessarily true. Haider Abdel-Shafi, who I mentioned several times in the book, who was, in a sense, perhaps the most revered of all Gazans, the man who won the highest vote in the PLC elections after Arafat came back in 1996, was a secular, had terrible trouble with Hamas, actually, was a leading secular figure in Palestinian politics and, of course, made that great speech at the Madrid conference. So, of course, I'm not completely negating your point, but I think there are counterpoints to be made.
Or are you also trying to say that, in fact, this diverging political, economic, religious, cultural trend in Gaza relative to the West Bank is largely the result of the political trajectory that Israel set it upon by developing the separation policy?
Well, I think Israel reinforced it, to put it at its mildest, in two ways. One was that for a long time it saw offshoot of the Mujama, the sort of offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, the forerunners of Hamas, as a counterweight to the PLO, and to some extent encouraged it. And the other is that I think the closure helped Gaza to turn in on itself, what the businessman Jawdat al-Khudri once described to me as the mental siege in Gaza.
What is a mental siege?
Well, I think what he meant was, everybody talks about the economic blockade, the economic squeeze of Gaza, but there is also something else, which is a society inevitably turned on itself by closure in a way that tends to suit more fundamentalist elements.
So let's talk more about the disengagement. Is Gaza still occupied or not?
Well, look.
You wanted to argue about it, so I'm giving you the first shot.
I think I say in my book that, there are a view that it's not, is basically shared by many in the Israeli government and by Hamas. Hamas say they liberated Gaza. This was their great achievement in 2005.
Contributing largely to their victory, right? In the elections.
It's certainly a major factor. I wouldn't say by any means the only factor.
No, I think contributing.
But a factor, yeah. And, of course, many people in Israel say, we left Gaza in 2005, we pulled right out. Now, it was absolutely true that internally this was a big break for Palestinians in Gaza. They no longer had that hated Abu Huli checkpoint in the middle of, separating the south from the north. It was possible to move freely within Gaza for the first time, and I don't remotely belittle that. The fact is, to rehearse it, Israel still controls the airspace, it still controls the territorial waters. Every Palestinian still has an Israeli-conferred ID, just like they do in the West Bank, and Israel determines who gets in and who gets out of Gaza. So I don't really worry about the technical term occupied, but
the UN report, the UN investigating commission certainly worry about that.
Yes, okay. I have pretty little patience with the idea that in any meaningful sense, it isn't occupied.
Right. I think the UN report was effective control.
Yeah, effective control. Gideon Levy's phrase was that the jailer moved outside, stopped being inside the jail and just moved to the outside.
But more substantively, I'd like to ask you, do you think, I know this is counterfactual, and you British/journalists/historians often recoil at these questions, but do you think that Gaza would have been better off if the disengagement hadn't taken place?
No, I don't. I think, let's just remember, actually, that what it was like having settlements in Gaza, not only for Palestinians, which was pretty terrible, massively restricted their movements, a very high proportion of the land was controlled by 8,000 people in a population then of over 1.5 million, but also for the settlers themselves. This was a kind of very, very violent place where There were frequent, mortar attacks. There were some terrible assassinations on that road in from the east to Kisafim. And, I could never understand myself how settlers stuck it out in Gaza, actually. But for Palestinians, it was also dreadful. I think, no, there are many criticisms about the way that disengagement was done. You can argue about that till the cows come home. It would not have been better off without it.
But is this sentiment shared by the Palestinians you spoke to? Because you said earlier that some, especially older Gazans, look back somewhat wistfully to the 1970s.
Yeah, he's talking about a much earlier era.
I'm talking really about an earlier period. Sorry, I may not have made that clear. I was really talking about the sort of 70s and early 80s when actually, it wasn't really until the 80s that settlement really started to expand in Gaza. So I wasn't talking about the settlers being there. I was talking about what was then an Israeli military occupation, much more than a civilian occupation.
But much more freedom of movement at the time.
Much more freedom of movement.
And did those settlements start largely after the evacuation of Sinai? Is that what happened? That some of those settlements?
Well, I think it's true that after the evacuation of Sinai, there was some movement
in
into
1982.
Gaza. In 1982, yeah. It was certainly in that period. There were earlier ones. There was Kfar Darom, which was actually a pre-state Jewish community in Gaza. There had been, and which was revived after the Six-Day War. But, yes, the big increase in settlements. Not, I think, entirely because of the evacuation of Sinai. This was a very nice place for settlers, for Israeli residents to go, especially if they were farming-minded. It was good soil, great climate, and a lot of cheap accommodation.
One of the things I appreciated about your book, there are many points at which you sort of, I assume consciously, bust some of the myths that are going around about Gaza. And one of those big myths, again, following up on the disengagement question, is, we hear in Israel all the time the criticism, well, we handed over Gaza. Why didn't the Palestinians turn it into a wonderful tourist resort by the sea, Singapore on the coast? Why haven't they done that?
Well, let me just start with the sort of being a devil's advocate here. There are Palestinians who say, we could have handled the period after disengagement much better. But you're quite right, Dahlia, in the sense that I think there are sort of two great things entered the Israeli DNA in the last 17 years. The first was that Arafat was offered a wonderful deal at Camp David by Barak, and he turned it down. I'm not here to argue about that at the moment.
You can't just raise that and drop it.
No, I'm not. No, but the other is exactly the one you've described, which I don't need to describe because you've already done it eloquently. What I try and show in the book is that it was a great deal less simple than that, in my view. I think that somebody who I think would almost certainly agree was the international figure most involved with the period immediately after disengagement, namely James Wolfenson, who was given the job of quartet envoy.
Yeah, it's a rather
Tony Blair's
emotional
predecessor, if you like.
It's a rather emotional part of the book, actually, where you describe his personal, exhaustive commitment to trying to make Gaza work.
I think Wolfenson really did feel, he had a mission. And one of the things that, I describe in the book is how he made a really big effort to sort of take over the greenhouses that the settlers had left, those that were still operating, and to really make that work for Palestinians. Now, there was a bit of looting after disengagement, absolutely no question. But the fact is that Palestinians did work, and in fact I quote a specific one who worked on that project that was set up really under Wolfenson, and they had terrible problems getting the agricultural produce that November and December out of Gaza. Karni was closed most of the time. I think the UN's estimate was that some 4% of the harvest up to December actually got out of Gaza.
4% got out. All the rest?
All the rest either just didn't make it across and then had to be sold to the local markets, or it rotted at Karni, waiting for security checks. Now, the Access and Movement Agreement, which Condoleezza Rice had negotiated in November, was specifically supposed to obviate that. And I just think that I think a number of things might have happened. I think, first of all, that Ariel Sharon might have performed disengagement in a more fraternal way with Mahmoud Abbas. I think there was a chance to show the Palestinians that, moderation and liking for negotiations rather than violence worked. I think he could have handled that much better. But I think the really main thing was there was a chance for the economy to really get off the ground, and if the AMA, which Condoleezza Rice had negotiated, had been implemented, then I think that would have been a vastly better start for post-disengagement Gaza. And I just don't think it's quite right to say we gave them a chance and all they gave us are rockets. Actually, there'd been quite a lot of rockets before disengagement.
That's also true.
Hamas and Fatah, since for the past decade, even more than a decade now, have been trying to work out some sort of power sharing agreement, unsuccessfully for myriad reasons. But my question to you is, does it really symbolize something? Is it are really Gaza and the West Bank separated beyond repair?
Well, of course, this means Hamas control Gaza, Fatah control the West Bank. So in that sense, it's a geographical split. But I think much more, it's a political split. I mean, there are plenty of people who don't support Hamas in Gaza, and there are quite a few in the West Bank who do support Hamas. So I don't think, but I mean, it's a disaster. And actually, one of the things that it took me some time to grasp in Gaza was the degree to which this really hurts Palestinians in Gaza. It eats away at their sense. I mean, I'm talking about the less politically aligned people, but even some of the politically aligned people, it eats away at their kind of national self-respect. It's a terrible thing. In fact, Hassan Ziada, who's a psychologist in Gaza, talking about sort of trauma in Gaza, and there's plenty of it, war, economic problems, the rest of it, actually mentioned the Fatah-Hamas thing as a source of anxiety and depression to individual Palestinian clients of the Gaza community mental health program.
What does that mean, actually? Why are they depressed over this national political split? Isn't it just politics?
First of all, I think most people recognize that this is a pretty disastrous split from their point of view. I mean, not least because the power that the two factions are fighting for is anyway so heavily circumscribed by Israel. And I think they understand that. But I think they also understand that you really need some kind of unified leadership if you're ever going to make serious progress with the Israelis. It may not be a sufficient condition, but it's probably a necessary one.
So the people themselves, are they still politically investment, or are they completely disinvested?
Well, that's a really good question, Gilad. I have been sort of shocked and a bit by the number of people who you say, would you vote in an election if it happened now? And they say, I can't see the point. Actually, I'm sure they would vote if there was an election. It's a kind of expression of it. But I mean, it is at least an expression of disgruntlement with the two factions. And I think that runs pretty deep.
Because I think one of the takeaways of your book that does take a long historical perspective on the issue is that, and I've been thinking that in relation to Russia, that's a separate issue, but similar, is that, no matter what political circumstances are, the people at the end of the day are completely screwed.
Why do you think that only in relation to Gaza and Russia? I would say that's kind of a global observation.
No, but especially in these places that, they've had it in so many ways, and still the bottom line is that there's really absolutely
One
no
of the things I try and do in this book, actually, about Gaza is to say that what's actually extraordinary about Palestinians in Gaza is that they don't give up completely. I mean, they don't stop hoping. And, if you look at a sort of normal Palestinian civilian in Gaza, what he or she has almost certainly been through is, really bad economic situation, 3 wars, and a split Palestinian polity, which is not a sort of great recipe for progress. And yet, they somehow keep going. They get up. If they've got work, they go to work every day. And actually, I don't think hope is dead. I do fear a bit for what will happen if the Fatah-Hamas reconciliation this time around breaks down, because I think a lot of hope is invested in that by Palestinians. And, that is going to be yet another major disappointment.
I want to go to some of those people that you talk about, because you really have colorful characters in there, too. The book opens with one of these sort of myth-busting scenes of a teacher in a class teaching Shakespeare to the students. What's the biggest gap between our image in the popular Western imagination of Gaza and what you see on the ground?
Well, I was touched by, sorry, this is an oblique way of answering your question, by something Sarah Roy, who's a great Gaza scholar at Harvard, was kind enough to say about the book, which is that it sort of elevates the ordinary to the extent that you realize that people in Gaza, paraphrasing, are much more like ourselves than we really think. And it's true. I mean, okay, education, you mentioned the school and Shakespeare, I mean, which was in a government school, not even a UN school, high school. Palestinians in Gaza are pretty education crazy. I mean, they really are proud if their they talk about the grades their kids got. There's still a very big university population. We now have, I think, 6 universities. There's a new one in Al-Zahra, Al-Isra. Everybody seems to want, I mean, not everybody goes to universities, and, there are very few. I mean, one of the weird things about education in Gaza is that, the graduate unemployment, I can't remember the up-to-date figure, but it's something over 60%. And yet, people still go to university, they still stay. If you're doing an engineering course, it's 5 years. They're pretty determined to graduate, and they're very proud of having done it. So that's one respect. I think there's a cultural life in Gaza which is often overlooked, which I've tried to talk about. I spent a little time with a painter, Maher Al-Daya. There's the Edward Said Music School. Now, I'm not suggesting, not everybody is going to the Edward Said Music School, of course. But, I mean, I think there is a cultural life in Gaza which we tend to overlook. And, yeah, I think Gaza City, as no Palestinian calls it, every Palestinian calls it just Gaza, 700,000 people. It's probably the most metropolitan and in many ways the most sophisticated of all Palestinian cities.
The interesting aspect of that Shakespeare anecdote is that Romeo and Juliet was banned from the curriculum because they didn't want a story of teenage suicide to give young Gazans any ideas.
Yes, I mean, I think it was partly that. I think it was also a feeling that it was just too sort of racy among some of the teachers in Gaza. But, Romeo and Juliet works in the West Bank, so I don't really... But you're right. No, this is a split. Romeo and Juliet is on the curriculum in the West Bank, and they have to stick with King Lear and Gaza.
That's how it starts.
I want to ask you about one of the concluding chapters of the book. You talk about this kind of futuristic fantasy where there's an agreement and there's this wonderful arc, sort of land arc connecting the West Bank and Gaza by rail, an international airport and a port, and everything could sort of work. It's a fantasy. It's a great fantasy. But I was struck by one little detail in that fantasy, and that was the cost. Right, because you write that in the RAND report it would have cost $33 billion over 10 years. That reminded me an awful lot of another figure, which was the $38 billion over 10 years that the Obama administration signed as a defense aid package to Israel. Would that money be better spent doing the fantasy of the RAND report rather than more military aid in this region?
Well, yes, in my view, it certainly would. Of course, that RAND report depended on the idea of being... I mean, basically what they were saying was, if we had a political agreement, this is what we could do. So the defense against that is, if you haven't got a political agreement, you don't have to do it. But I mean...
Well, that was my next question. Is do they have any solutions, not just for the money, but for the politics of it?
Well, I think it's sort of pretty crazy for someone like me, really a spectator, to sort of pretend that we have a simple solution. I mean, what I do say in the book is, leaving aside the much bigger picture, and by the way, I mean, just to go back to your earlier question, I do think the failure by the US and to a very large extent by the rest of the international community to put pressure on the parties, but particularly the strongest party, and I think Nathan Thrall's book is, completely irresistible on this subject.
Namely Israel.
Yeah,
namely
Israel.
A Tel Aviv Review guest of ours, so everybody should listen to that episode as well.
Thrall,
well, I mean, I think he makes the case far better than I ever could that, pressure on Israel would do it. But what I do suggest is that in Gaza specifically, leaving aside the much bigger question, but still very urgent question of a solution to the whole conflict, I do think that there are things that can be done and risks that could be taken. And I do think that a measure of economic opportunity brought back to Gaza, which I don't think necessarily would, any more than Condoleezza Rice did in November 2005, compromise Israeli security, would actually be a tremendous advance. I mean...
And will it promote mending the political rift between the factions? Do you see that as really the main stumbling block for now? I mean, until major efforts are being made to solve the conflict writ large?
Well, I mean, hold on. I think Actually, I'm very surprised when I'm Palestinians in Gaza. Quite often, I sometimes find myself there sort of blaming Hamas for everything. And although I'm extremely critical, to say the least, of Hamas, I find myself saying, but surely they're not the only problem. What about Israel, kind of thing? It's sort of weird conversations you can get into. But I do not know. I think Fatah Hamas is a huge obstacle, but I do not think it is the only obstacle. And yes, obviously, if you start to have external political progress, it helps. It helps Fatah and Hamas. It makes Hamas maybe feel that it was quite sensible to move a little bit their sort of outlook to the two-state solution, as it was, in May of this year. And maybe, it will bring them closer together. So I don't think it's the only obstacle.
So in a way, what you're saying is that it would be, we always assume there has to be this precondition that Hamas and Fatah reconcile before there can be progress on the peace process. But you're saying, in a way, external process might help that reconciliation.
Well, I think, yes, if you have a political horizon, then it makes it much more important for the factions to work out how they're going to handle that political horizon. And I do not think that the lack of a political horizon, and indeed absolutely zero economic horizon, helps that process at all. So I think the opposite would, to some extent.
There are several labels have been said about Gaza that you cite in the book. One, of course, is the open-air jail, a famous quip, and also Condoleezza Rice's A Terrorist Wasteland. Which of the two do you think characterizes Gaza in 2018 better?
Well, look, I've just written a book which is partly devoted to saying this is a great deal more than a terrorist wasteland. So you wouldn't expect me to say that's it. I think the jail may be overdone as a metaphor, but you don't have to spend much time at Erez, the crossing into Israel, to think this is kind of a bit like a jail. An Israeli taxi driver once took me to Erez from Jerusalem. And he was very straightforward. I would think quite likely a liquid voter, working class background. His father had a shop in Ashdod. He said a lot of Gazans at that time used to work there. And he said, I haven't been to Gaza for 20 years. And he said two things that really stuck in my mind. One was, he said, they're not going anywhere, we're not going anywhere, and somehow we have to find a solution to that. And the other thing, when we came to that gigantic Erez terminal, which of course he'd never seen because it was only built in the last 12 years or so, he said, it's a jail. Just like that. I didn't say, what do you think of it?
But still, everybody should read the book to figure out exactly why. That's Don Macintyre talking about Gaza, Preparing for Dawn, published by One World. Donald, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you very much.
And also a big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. We would also like to thank Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro and the Romay Foundation, who made a very generous contribution to the Tel Aviv Review. You too can help us survive. Please donate to our Patreon campaign by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. You will help our quest for knowledge and learning, and you'll get presents. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our archive on the same address. There are over 400 interviews to keep you busy, entertained, hopefully a bit annoyed too. Like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel, and follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.